From Anderson Silva picking Nate Diaz as his favorite, to Conor McGregor believing that Diaz will slap Paul's head off. Here's pros predicting the upcoming fight between Jake Paul and Nate Diaz. First off, Silva seems to disagree with the odds makers. Almost everybody seems to think that Nate is coming into this fight as a heavy underdog, and it kind of makes sense why. Nate's always fought as an MMA fighter, so this whole boxing gig is going to be a different playing field. Of course, that doesn't mean he'll do badly. He's known to be a great striker, and that's also something that he's primarily relied on throughout his UFC career. With that in mind, people still seem to think that taking this fight was a bad idea. Paul is a younger and bigger opponent after all. Still, it seems like Diaz has a few people in his corner, with one of them being Anderson Silva. If there's anyone who can talk smack about both guys and their skills in the stand-up game, it's going to be Silva, who talked about how he believes that a lot of people aren't looking at the fight from the right perspective. That's because he believes that Nate's cardio is going to be the real champ here. Diaz has some insane stamina, and he definitely has the striking skills to back it all up. He definitely has the chin to take hits from Jake, which is probably why Silva seems to be picking him as his favorite in this fight. Though, while everybody seems to be busy picking their favorites, you have to wonder what the fight will be like when it finally happens. Well, it's going to be epic because of all the hype that's surrounding it right now. Everybody's psyched to see if Paul can make a comeback after his recent loss to Fury. Then there's a bunch of MMA fans who are ready to stand Diaz to death and are hoping that he puts Paul in his place. There's no doubt that Diaz will come into this fight with huge support, thanks to his infamous UFC career. Nate managed to make a big name for himself in the UFC as one of the faces of the company and as a certified bad boy. Both these dudes are going to be looking to destroy each other, and there's a good chance we'll get to see a knockout toward the middle or end of the fight. The first few rounds are probably going to be slow, with both Paul and Diaz feeling each other out. Though, once they figure each other out a bit, it'll be like watching an all-out war. There's a good chance that this fight builds up enough hype to break records. You see, despite having entered combat sports so late, Paul always manages to attract huge crowds. With Nate added to the mix, things are definitely about to get hella spicy. It's pretty surprising how a lot of UFC pros aren't too happy with the matchup. You'd think that the entire UFC roster would come out in support of Nick Diaz. Though sadly, that's not the case. Up until now, the Suga Show popped up out of nowhere and posted a tweet talking about how hyped he was about the upcoming fight. At least there's someone out there who seems to be supportive of the event. Another fighter, Sean Strickland, came out and talked about how this fight is a joke. He mentioned how Diaz has always been a 155er, and him facing off against someone like Paul, who's always fought in a heavier weight class, doesn't really make sense. Honestly, I kinda agree with the guy. It does seem a bit weird to match these two guys up, with one of them having such an obvious weight advantage. Who knows, maybe Paul will end up cutting down on his weight. Though, any last-minute changes like that seem unlikely. Now, Dylan Dennis came out and tweeted about the fight too. He took a similar tone as Strickland and made fun of the bout. Basically, he talked about how Paul faced off against an actual pro boxer for the first time and ended up blowing it up big time. He also mentioned how Tommy Fury isn't even that good of a boxer, so when Jake lost that matchup, well, any respect he'd gained from all these guys, that went down the drain pretty quickly. Speaking of which, Paul's last fight didn't end so well. The last time Jake stepped into the ring, he went up against one of the Furies. More specifically, he faced off against Tommy Fury, the first person he's fought till now, who's an actual pro boxer. This was his chance to show the world that he's not someone to be taken lightly. However, he ended up blowing it big time and lost to Fury via decision. A lot of people expected him to have the upper hand during the fight, but throughout the bout, he kinda looked like he was just swinging punches. Tommy, on the other hand, looked way more in the zone, and it felt like his attacks were coordinated well. After all was said and done, Paul ended up taking a big L and had to take back a lot of trash talk he'd spewed out in the previous few months. After watching his fight against a proper fighter, it's clear that Jake still has a long way to go. He's definitely good enough to take down most fighters, but his specialty seems to lie in beating up older, washed-up pros. I thought he'd move past that, though it looks like he's back to his old ways, now that he's facing off against Diaz on August 5th. he's going to need to level his game up big time, because unless he brings something new to the table, he probably won't be able to make it to the end of the fight. Diaz, on the other hand, is a cardio beast. Nate's last fight was against Tony Ferguson, back when he owes the UFC one more fight in his contract. This was just before he got released from his contract, so he wasn't under any pressure to win. Still, despite all of that, he managed to put on one hell of a show. He had Ferguson on his back foot throughout the fight, and it didn't look like there was much he could do. Sure, Tony tried his best to counter and fight back to the best of his ability, but there wasn't much to be done. Eventually, Diaz ended up choking him out and finished the job. If Diaz brings that sort of level into the fight, there's no telling how badly he'll destroy Jake. He's not just an amazing striker, he's also got a great ground game. While the ground game isn't relevant this time around, it shows how versatile he can be during a fight. That sort of thing is hard to come by, and when a fighter pops up, who can make great decisions during a fight, well, he becomes unbeatable in the ring. Thankfully, Nate seems to possess this ability, and I feel like it's going to help a lot in his fight against Jake. Since Paul is a heavier fighter, he'll probably end up gassing out faster, and have slower reactions as well. That 30-pound difference is going to stir up all kinds of trouble for both guys. But I'm betting Diaz will be able to handle it better than Jake. That's probably why McGregor thinks Nate will slap the out of Paul. Despite their long history, Conor McGregor came out in support of Diaz. You'd think that he'd side with Paul in this one and start hurling insults Nate's way. However, what ended up happening was surprising to say the least. But honestly, it was a pretty nice gesture to see. See, Conor believes that since Nate has so much more experience than Jake, he has a better chance of coming out on top. While Nate might not be a pure boxer, he's still one of the best strikers in UFC history. That, coupled with the insane experience he's managed to rack up throughout his career, well, it's going to be hard for Jake to be able to do much. All he'll really be able to do is try his best to survive the fight. Sure, there are people out there who seem to think that Paul has the fight in the bag, but they seem to be forgetting just how lethal Nate can be. This is the same man who delivered a Stockton slap to Conor during their fight. Not many people have the guts to pull something like that. He's always calm and collected, and that's something that Conor talked about as well. Now that McGregor's placing his bets on Diaz, so it'll be interesting to see what ends up happening. We can try and predict how the fight will end up going, but for what it's worth, Diaz might be a heavy underdog coming into this fight. But if McGregor's taking his side, then he's probably got something epic up his sleeve. We just have to sit tight till August 5th to find out. So, from Conor McGregor believing that Diaz will slap Paul's head off, to Anderson Silva picking Nate Diaz as his favorite. This was pros predicting the upcoming fight between Jake Paul and Nate Diaz.